Welcome to Focus on Why, the podcast where reflection sparks action. I'm Amy Rowlandson, and together we'll explore compelling stories, profound insights, and transformative experiences from inspiring guests worldwide. Feeling lost or unfulfilled? Searching for clarity, purpose, or meaning in your work and life? This podcast invites you on a journey of self-discovery to align your work with your values, shape your future with intention, and create a purposeful way of life. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why. Do you truly understand the power of a focus on why in business? Are your employees fully engaged? Do they consider their work meaningful? Or does your organisation have purpose gaps? Focusing on key areas of employee engagement, contribution, fulfilment, well-being and purpose, all of which have proven links to increased productivity and profitability, I deliver inspiring, mesmerising and captivating talks and workshops providing clear, actionable steps to take. To discuss your specific business needs, reach out to me via the link in the show notes and together we can plug those purpose gaps. Today on Focus on Why, I'm joined by Barnaby Wiener. Barnaby, welcome.
Thank you, Amy. It's great to be here.
So, as I always ask, what is it that you're focusing on right now?
Well, I knew you were going to ask me that question, so I did have a little time to think about it. And it's interesting because initially I thought, well, there was actually a whole load of things I am focusing on. It's hard to pinpoint just one thing because I sort of did this exercise about a year and a half ago for what are my priorities in life and came up with about 12 different priorities around family, friends, activities, being outside, cultural, learning, etc. But I think we'd need 3 hours to talk about them all. And also, I don't think that in most cases I have very much that's interesting to say about them. So I guess the number one thing I'm focusing on is managing our charitable foundation, Treebeard Trust, which I set up about 15 years ago with my wife, and which since about April last year has been my full-time occupation. And it's really my sort of overarching passion.
So what led you to setting that up 15 years ago, Barnaby?
Well, most of my career was in the investment industry. And I got to a point in my early 40s where, firstly, I'd been very fortunate in the degree of financial security. And I think that sort of triggered a sort of minor midlife crisis or early midlife crisis of just what am I doing this for? And I had sort of came to the conclusion with my wife that we would like to sort of start giving back and do so in a sort of more structured and formal way than just the sort of impulsive ad hoc way of giving money whenever someone gets in touch because they're running a marathon or hosting a charity dinner or something. So that's how it sort of started. And in particular, I realized that there were some parts of the investment activity that really appealed to me, but I felt could be sort of replicated more broadly than just the sort of humdrum matter of trying to find opportunities to make money. In other words, I really loved analyzing investment opportunities and really digging into what drove those businesses that I was looking at. And it occurred to me that one could take the same approach to philanthropy, but actually that most people don't. So I think there are many people who have a very sort of rigorous, hard-nosed approach to commercial matters. And then when it comes to giving back, they almost sort of park their brain to one side and just follow their heart and their instincts. And not to say that your instinct and your emotions aren't an important part of it, but I think there's a lot of value in bringing that sort of commercial rigor to philanthropy. So that's really, I think, become the sort of, I guess, overarching sort of focus of mine is how to marry the two, how to marry that commercial rigor with sort of philanthropic intention.
And what I'm interested in is you said that in your early 40s that you were fortunate enough to have a degree of financial security. Now, my experience of that is that the majority of people, it's not fortunate, it's through clever timing, investment in your own development of your own career. Some people, yes, inherit money, but when you say you're very fortunate, it is a case of you've also worked hard to get to this point, or perhaps not.
Well, I suppose so, but I still think so much of everything in life comes down to good fortune. I think yes, there is an element of making the most of the cards you're given, and so there was an element of that. But I think generally I have been dealt a pretty fortunate hand throughout my life. So I do think I'm gonna stick with the fortune rather than skill as being the overarching reason why I found myself in the position I was in.
And that's interesting because it is skill that you're applying to your purpose right now. It is this commercial rigor that you're saying that you are bringing into the space of philanthropy. And so it is a very intentional space that you're now operating in, which is great. And tell me a bit more about what the trust does.
Sure. I always am envious of people. There are a lot of people who've set up sort of charitable activities or foundations where they have very specific. We're focusing on mental health, or we're focusing on a particular region, or whatever. I'm incapable of focusing, which is probably interesting that you got me on this podcast about focus. I find it very difficult to say, this particular sector or issue is the one we want to tackle. And same with my wife and the rest of our trustees. So I guess the way I would characterize it is we back talented entrepreneurs with a vision for changing lives for the better. We operate primarily in the UK, also in East Africa, purely because I've spent a bit of time there. And we have supported organizations in any number of different sectors, including violence against women, refugees, criminal justice, young people, mental health, nature recovery, food system, seaweed, you name it. And so lots of different areas. I think one thing that is quite distinctive about our approach is we don't distinguish particularly between the vehicle of the organization we're supporting. So I would say most charitable foundations focus their time on giving money, grant making to charities, and then their investment capital is usually handed over to a third party asset manager to manage for financial return. Whereas we have a more blended approach. We do make grants to nonprofits, but we also invest our capital in impact driven organizations. So to give you an example, bring that to life, I said earlier, one of the areas we're quite focused on is criminal justice, or we spend a lot of time here, and broadly driven by our criminal justice system is a mess, and it doesn't need to be. It's actually one of the few things I think that could be made better without incurring cost to the public purse. And it really just requires a change of mindset of what the purpose of criminal justice is, and essentially about giving people who have experience of the criminal justice system, most of whom I would argue are there because of misfortune, not because they're inherently bad people. Definitely not because they're inherently bad people. And so we have, in that field, we've supported an organization like the Howard League, which is in fact probably the oldest criminal justice charity in the world. It's about 160 years old. And that's their whole focus is on trying to reform penal reform and reform the system. We've also provided debt funding to an organization, another nonprofit called the Clink, which is to fund their catering business. They use offenders and ex-offenders to provide catering, including restaurants in prisons, but also external catering as a means of providing a route to employment post-release. And we are also an equity investor in a chain of coffee shops called Redemption Roasters, which is doing the same thing. So I could give other examples of that where using essentially the whole of our financial clout across the investment portfolio and the grant making budget to try and drive change. And that's really what we do in a nutshell.
It's amazing. I've had a couple of guests talk about the criminal justice system. I've had Dr. Louise Hewitt and I've had Jazz Singh, and both very similar to you, speaking about how it's broken and how it's a very fine line that you tread to be on the right side of justice, and how badly it can go wrong when, particularly for what Louise is championing, which is Innocence Project, for sometimes once you have been put into prison as a result of they're innocent, but they've been put in prison. It's very hard to get out because the criminal system the criminal justice system requires you to say you're guilty. So yes, I hear you, and I think it's wonderful the work that you're doing, and absolutely, it's not necessarily because people are inherently bad. There's many reasons that have led them to where they are. So thank you for championing them and giving people a better chance. And you're right, it's also the change of mindset, and it's how we, as collectively, give people a second chance and don't label them. And yeah, I mean, we're slightly off on a tangent here, but it is something that is have been brought to the center of my podcast a couple of times, and I always feel there's a reason why it keeps coming again. So this diverse interest that you have, I also have a value, which is diversity. And don't ask me to pin myself down to one area. That's why I have a podcast called Focus on Why, because it allows me to speak to everybody, which is fantastic. So going back to that decision last year in April 2024, when you said, right, this is my full time, any regrets?
Not at all. I was very lucky. I worked in an industry that, I think it's a fantastic industry to work in, and I also worked for a company. It was a great company to work for. So I was 26 years in the same company, and they tolerated all my foibles, and I'm very grateful. It gave me a lot of autonomy, and I'm very grateful for that. I eventually just got to the point where my interest in what we were doing with Treebeard had got to the point it was becoming unsustainable to hold down a proper job and do it. So the reason I left was not because I was in any way sort of frustrated or bored of what I was doing. It's just that this was absorbing too much of my time. So it's been great to be able to focus all my energy on it, and no regrets.
Love that. So tell me, what is it that is holding you in this space? What is it you want to create in terms of, you mentioned that this commercial rigor can be brought into philanthropy and that it's got a lot of value. What else is there that you can bring to this space?
To be honest, just doing what we do, and we're being able to provide funding of one sort or another, whether it's grant funding or investment funding to typically small, very early stage projects that is going to help them to get off the ground or grow, and providing whatever other support we can provide, which I think is limited because there's not, we're not the experts in the room, but we just the emotional support sometimes. I'm struck by what a tough job it is to be an entrepreneur, to set something up and to have a vision and then convert that vision into a reality. I am in awe of entrepreneurs. And so just the ability to play some role in that and interact with them is just an enormous source of satisfaction. So that in itself, I think that's the main thing that in our small way we can bring. I think the other thing is just getting people to rethink this, what I would call really quite artificial barrier between philanthropy and business. I mean, it sounds a bit trite, but I always think if businesses were run more like charities and charities were run more like businesses, the world would be a better place. I think that in many cases, corporates succumb to greed and short-termism, which ultimately is to the detriment of all their stakeholders, not just their customers, their employees, their communities, etc., and the environment that they operate in, but actually even for their own shareholders in the long run. And equally, on the charity side, I think there are lots of charities that are invariably run by people with very good intentions, but sometimes with a lack of accountability, with a lack of rigor. One of the inherent problems of the charity world is there isn't a direct feedback loop that you have with businesses. For business isn't delivering what its customers want, it discovers that very quickly. With a charity, in order to be financially sustainable, it needs to persuade this external group of funders to back it. But actually, the people it should be worrying about are its service users, its beneficiaries, or whatever. So having the ability to reflect and really evaluate the impact a charity is having is rare. I think that a lot of charities don't do a very good job of that. And I also think on a sort of another aspect of this, there is there's an uncomfortable sort of imbalance in the charity world where you have a lot of problems need to be solved philanthropically, but you still end up with this issue where beneficiaries are sort of are dependent on the largesse of donors, and it's an unhealthy power imbalance. So I'm just a huge believer if there is a commercial solution, it's a much more sustainable solution. And the old adage, what people need is a handshake, not a handout, or they need to be taught to fish, not given a fish. All that, those sort of cliches are true, and I think that to the extent that we can find solutions which enable people to make a success of their lives rather than encourage a continued sort of sense of dependency. That's that's a very long-winded answer, but essentially that's the sort of thing that sort of probably more than anything drives me. It's just getting people to accept a sort of more blurred distinction between the two, and then specifically foundations, charitable foundations, but also other people with capital to deploy, is to embrace this idea of investing for impact, that there are opportunities to invest your capital in a way that can still create a financial return, a decent financial return, and have hugely positive impact. And that's, I think, what's lacking in the investment world today. If you talk to most people in the investment world, they think through there are two lenses: risk and return. I take more risk, I'll get more return. And those are the way that's how people think about it. If we could get to a three-dimensional world where people thought about risk, return, and impact, I think that could be incredibly powerful.
So, what is it that you can do, Barnaby, to make this a more viable option for people to adopt?
Well, at least within the world of trusts and foundations, it's a relatively small world, and there are networks. There's a couple in particular. One is called the Social Impact Investors Group. The other is the more recently formed one, Environmental Impact Investors Group, which is made up mainly of charitable foundations and also some high net worth philanthropists. And there is a growing interest, which I'm really excited by, a growing interest from some of the larger foundations to explore this. And some of them are doing it already inside. So there is this sort of growing community within at least within the philanthropic world. But there's a lot more. I mean, most foundations that are doing this are still only deploying a very small percentage of their assets into impact investing. So I think the scope to grow what they're doing, and for those that haven't yet started to build that. And I think then, it's to what extent can we take this mainstream? I mean, I hope that as it becomes better understood, as it becomes better resourced, because the problem with building any new market is you're faced with this chicken and egg situation where you need a certain amount of demand in order to be able to put in enough supply in order to stimulate enough demand. And right now the impact investment marketplace is so small. There's just not enough resource there. People who are actively doing it, who can help those who want to explore it, and that will only come about once the market builds. So the short answer to your question, what can we do, is basically just talk to as many people as possible about what we're doing. So we at Treebeard, we now have something like 35% of our endowment invested directly for impact, and our stated goal is to get to 50%. And we talk about what we're doing to people who are minded to do the same. There are plenty of people who are not minded to do the same. There's still many people you speak to and they say, business is business, charity is charity, don't confuse the two or whatever. So it takes time to shift people's perspectives. But I think there are plenty of people who are at least open to the idea.
Do you feel that purpose is the overlap?
Definitely. I think that, and it took me a long time to figure this out, but I think purpose is, as you have so eloquently stated in your podcast and in your book, Amy, which I have read and loved, a life without purpose is a life without, I think everyone has to figure out what their purpose is. And when you have a purpose, whatever that purpose is, when you have a purpose, you're energized. And in this case, definitely for me, I got to a stage where the simple process of looking for opportunities to make money with no other thought for what I was trying to achieve just became boring and pointless. And I also think, taking a step back, we live in a capitalist system. we've tried, if you look at the history of the world, there have been alternatives tried. None of them have been particularly work particularly well. So I am a capitalist. I believe in the free markets, fundamentally. But capitalism can only work if it is fundamentally a tool for allocating resources for the good of society. It's a way for people to figure out how to deliver what we all need in order to survive and lead our best lives. And I think that something has been lost, and maybe, I think greed has been around since we started, but definitely that overarching vision of why we live in a capitalist society and why capitalism is the right system for allocating resources has to be based on the concept that it needs to work for everyone, for all stakeholders. And I think that in the investment world, that has to some degree been forgotten by many people operating in it. That, ultimately, if you speak to a lot of people, the purpose of investing is to generate financial returns. And we've had a very sort of interesting debate in the last few years at the sort of macro level in the investing world, where you had this growing focus on ESG factors, which I think is incredibly important. I think also it was sort of in many cases implemented in a clumsy and cynical way. But then there's been a clash with between the sort of ESG brigade on the one hand and the and quite how to describe them on the other. But those who say let's not forget what our purpose is. Our purpose is to generate good financial returns. And in the US, there's even a sort of legal sort of fiduciary duty aspect of this, which is your goal as an investment firm is to make money for your clients. There's no, which is sort of weird when you sort of step back and think about it, because I would have thought there should be some legal obligation to make sure that you're doing it in such a way that it's also beneficial to society as a whole. But so, yeah, that is an ever running debate. But for me, it's just completely, it's just unequivocal. If we don't have a system of capitalism that is broad and sort of focused on creating value for all, then it's not sustainable.
I hear you. And purpose washing is a thing. It's becoming more and more an issue. The disconnect between the intention and the actual action is huge, and it also is leading to a lack of fulfillment and meaning for the workplace because of that disconnect, creating purpose gaps. So I'm working hard on eliminating those purpose gaps, but first you have to make people aware of them, and some people aren't aware of them or don't believe they exist. So my work is ongoing, but with nearing 80% to 79%, as quoted by Gallup, of the global workplace either not engaged or actively disengaged in their work. We've got a huge issue here in terms of lack of productivity, but lack of purpose running through the workplace. And yeah, it's a huge issue. And I'm with you that it has to be for the good of the people and the good of the planet. And that, yes, profit has to feature to be sustainable, but not at the cost of the people or the planet. So, Barnaby, I have a question in terms of legacy, because this is a living legacy. You're getting to enjoy the ripple effects of your work. You're getting to see the empowered people across the UK and East Africa at the moment of the work that you're doing. What's the big picture here?
I don't really have a big vision in terms of legacy. I sort of feel like I want to do this to the best of my ability. And so just carry on doing what we're doing is probably or doing it better, I should say. Getting better at finding great partners to support and being as supportive as we can be. I work very closely at Treebeard with a couple of people, but one particularly, Shishir Malhotra, who is our investment director, and we work together on this. And one of the things that we're really keen to explore is how we can leverage what we, and particularly what he's doing, to sort of to build something, to help a number of other foundations and like-minded investors to deploy their capital more impactfully. So that's something that we, may well be, if we had a conversation in 5 years' time, it may well be that we can sort of, that's progressed and we're able to sort of support many others on this journey. But no, other than that, I feel like I hope we'll have another. Well, goodness, we don't know how long. I'll be 60 in just over a year's time. So the end is not nigh, but I'm not going to be doing this for another 4 decades. But if I can do it for another 2 or even 3, I'd be delighted. Yeah. And then if my children were minded to sort of take it up thereafter, I'd be even more delighted. But I don't want to enshackle them with a burden that they didn't seek.
Couple of questions. Firstly, you mentioned about the moving from 35% to 50% invested as a metric. How are you measuring success within your trust?
Well, so the 35-50 is a very simple one, which is just we have a very strict definition of what constitutes an impact investment, and that's just the percentage of our assets that are invested in impact investments. In terms of how we measure success or performance, with our grant making, obviously there's no financial return. Every time we write a check for a grant, the money's gone, it's not coming back. So what we've put in place is we're very wary of sort of impact metrics, because sometimes the most important things just don't lend themselves to being measured. But what we do have is we've sort of more recently developed a framework where essentially we're agreeing with our partners up front what their objectives are, what is it that they're trying to achieve, essentially how they are evaluating their progress. And so we measure them against that, and we can sort of, in very simple terms, see who's sort of making good progress and who's perhaps struggling. So that's and we're going to roll that out across our impact investments. And then obviously with the impact investments, there is an element of the measurement which is financial. I mean, in aggregate, we want to generate a reasonable financial return from our impact investments. And we want that for 2 reasons. One is that we are committing a sizable chunk of our endowment into this. So our goal is to get to 50%. If that 50% doesn't generate any financial return, then our ability to carry on funding our grant making is going to be seriously impaired. So we need it to work in order to carry on what we're doing. But we also want it to work because, to some extent, we want to demonstrate that that this idea that you are throwing away money if you're investing for impact is wrong. And of course, there's a spectrum. There are investments we make which are explicitly high risk and often low return, particularly the debt investments, where we're providing debt funding to sometimes quite risky projects at quite low rates of return. We know we're not going to get a commercial return on our debt portfolio, but we hopefully will get the money back for most cases, and it won't be a disaster. And then with our equity investments, if a handful, we're investing in early stage companies, and so it only takes a few of them to do really well, and actually we'll be okay. So yeah, so the answer to your question is we're measuring our success through a combination of financial return, but also impact. And there have been financial investments we made which have gone to zero, but we still feel actually we had quite a lot of impact in those investments. And the only other thing I'd say is that people are obsessed with measuring investment returns over very short periods of time. In some parts of the investment world, people are measured on a quarterly basis, which has always struck me as ridiculous. From our perspective, I think you need 10 or 20 years before you can really evaluate how someone has, how your investment portfolio has performed, because it takes a long time for things to come to fruition. So yeah, that's being patient is an important part of it.
And you mentioned that the most important things aren't conducive to being measured. What do you consider those to be?
Well, bearing in mind a lot of interventions are really about changing people's lives. I just think that's, how do you measure the impact on someone's life? A lot of organizations will say, well, we impacted 3,000 people last year. But how do you measure that? And what was the impact on those people? Oh, well, we did a survey of our, service users, and they tick that box that said they feel better having and I'm thinking, this doesn't feel like a very robust measurement. I mean, you can have an incredible impact on one life that not only transforms that life, but because of that life transform, ends up transforming many other lives because that individual becomes this sort of extraordinary force for good. I should say, Amy, I listened to your podcast with Jazz Singh, and I loved it. So, in fact, it's about the first and only time I've ever listened to a podcast twice. I enjoyed it so much. And then I reached out to him and met up with him. And that seems to me, so he's a classic example of someone whose life was transformed, not largely by his entirely through his own experience. And as a result of that, and reaching incredible lows, and then sort of having a sort of redemptive experience, he's now clearly a great force for having a positive impact on lots of other people's lives. So you just cannot begin to measure that kind of thing. I'm sure there are many other things that are difficult to measure, and I'm also very conscious of the old adage that what gets measured gets managed. So once you start putting metrics in place, it's so easy for an organization to stop actually worrying about what it is they're trying to do and just focus on delivering on their metrics. So it can be very dangerous.
I think we should continue the conversation afterwards, Barnaby, because I have got a way of measuring the different types of meaningful success, which is very much aligned with what you are talking about, that gives a perspective that covers, yes, it covers financial success, but it also is measuring personal growth, relationships, emotional well-being, legacy and impact. And for me, I can't tell you how much it means that you reached out and you've met up with Jazz, having listened to an episode. For me, it gave me goosebumps when you were just saying that, because it directly taps into my core values of connectedness and contribution. And so thank you for doing that, because that's exactly what this show is all about. It's not just reflection, it's then taking subsequent action as a result. And so for me, mission accomplished. That's why I record these episodes, to get awareness out there, but then for people to take action as a result of. So thank you. Brilliant.
Well, thank you for facilitating that introduction, even though you weren't aware of it.
And this is the thing, this is another part of the success metrics, is that, yes, you may know at the time that you measure something, what the impact is, but there will be ripple effects that go on and on and on and continue that you will never know. I know that there are many things that happen as a result of the show. People listen to it, they then go off and they do their own thing. They might not even know that something they've heard instigated an action for them, because they were just, I remember something happening, can't remember where it came from, but they took action on it and they've done it. So I take great solace in just knowing that at some point it has made a shift. And that's why I do what I do. Barnaby, what a great conversation, and what a great opportunity for you to find yourself in right now, or have created for yourself. This is the thing I talk about, is that you don't just find your purpose, you create it, you feel it from within. And this is very much a conscious, intentional purpose that you are living right now. How could people reach out and say, I need to have a conversation with Barnaby right now?
Sure. I am on LinkedIn. You can reach me there. We do have a website, treebeardtrust.org, in which I'm afraid we say, please don't reach out with speculative applications, because we don't have the capacity to do it. So if you've got, if people have got great projects, feel free to reach out. But I should say we have limited capacity for assessing everything that comes in. But yeah, happy to talk to anyone who's interested in this area.
So thank you, Barnaby, for sharing everything you're doing. It really is incredible work. I'd love to know, before I ask you for some final words, can you also share your reasoning behind Treebeard?
Yeah, so Treebeard was a character from Lord of the Rings, an Ent. And Lord of the Rings was a book both my wife and I love, growing up, and have each read about 3 or 4 times over the course of our lives. And if you are familiar with it, you know that Treebeard and the Ents are essentially tree-like people who are very slow and ponderous in their decision-making. In fact, they have conversations that go on for days, which to an outsider, you're not even aware they're having conversations, because they pause and think for so long between speaking. But when they do eventually make a decision, they take decisive action. So we thought that just was a good symbol of how we all should go about sort of addressing problems rather than sort of impulsive talking over each other and then sort of making sort of impulsive decisions. Is a bit of reflection first.
It's my husband's favourite book, and absolutely, he's listening to it again right now. So with you on that. So great choice of name. Final words, please, Barnaby.
So one thing I'm really struck by is just how toxic and polarized so much public debate has become, and how easy it is for us to sort of fall into a position on this or that issue and sort of create this sort of divide. It's just very unhealthy. So I guess one thing I've been thinking about, and I don't have any answers to this, is how both we as in Treebeard Trust, but also we more broadly, society, can sort of what we can do to tackle this. Because I think in some ways it's the biggest problem facing us is if we can't interact as people in a sort of collaborative and cooperative way, ultimately that bodes very poorly for our ability to manage our future. And so I'm really interested in exploring that and how we can develop a more collaborative environment to coexist in.
This episode's over, but let's keep the conversation going. How has this episode impacted you? Share your insights, takeaways, and reflections with actions on social media, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Your feedback creates powerful ripple effects, helping others to discover its value. Want to dive deeper into purpose? Check the show notes for links on how to work with me, where to buy my new book, Focus on Why, Create a Purposeful Way of Life, available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook, and where to sign up for Friday Focus, my weekly newsletter. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why.